All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into something that's making waves in the sustainable finance world.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Goldman Sachs's new Biodiversity Bond Fund.
It's pretty groundbreaking stuff.
We hear a lot about green bonds,
Right.
but this is taking things a step further and specifically targeting biodiversity loss.
That's right.
And it's doing it through fixed income investments, which I think is pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's a really interesting approach.
So it's opening up this whole new avenue for supporting biodiversity
Absolutely.
for people who might not be comfortable dabbling in, riskier asset classes.
Yeah, exactly.
And, it's not like Goldman Sachs just suddenly decided to care about the planet.
Right.
They've actually been building up to this for quite a while.
They have quite a track record.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that history?
Yeah, so, going back almost 2 decades, they were one of the first U.S. banks to come out with an environmental policy framework.
Wow, 2005. That was way ahead of the curve.
Yeah, they were real pioneers. And then in 2007, they launched GS Sustain.
Okay.
And that was a research strategy that started integrating ESG performance into their investment decisions.
So they were really putting their money where their mouth was.
Yeah, absolutely. And then by 2019, they had mobilized over $100 billion in clean energy financing.
That's a serious chunk of change.
Yeah, it is. And then it all kind of culminated in this massive $750 billion commitment to climate transition and inclusive growth by 2030.
That's huge.
It is. They're really putting some serious weight behind their sustainability goals.
So it's not just greenwashing. It sounds like they're really in it for the long haul.
I think so. Yeah, their actions definitely speak louder than words.
Okay, so let's talk about this Biodiversity Bond Fund.
Sure.
Why biodiversity? Why not just stick with, the climate change focus that everyone's already talking about?
Well, biodiversity loss is a really big deal.
It is.
And it actually poses some serious financial risks.
Okay, so how does that work?
Well, think about it. When ecosystems start to degrade, you get problems with resource scarcity.
Right.
Supply chains can get disrupted. And we're even seeing a link to increased disease outbreaks.
Wow, so this is something that affects everyone, not just, tree huggers.
Exactly. It's an economic issue as much as it is an environmental one.
So ignoring biodiversity loss could actually hit our wallets pretty hard.
It could. That's why this fund is so important. It's bringing attention to this critical issue and offering a way to address it.
Okay, so for someone like me who, isn't a Wall Street expert,
Sure.
can you break down how this fund actually works?
Yeah, absolutely. So the fund uses this kind of two-pronged approach.
Okay.
About 20% of the fund is invested in bonds that are specifically earmarked for biodiversity projects.
So things like reforestation.
Yeah, exactly. Things like restoring forests, cleaning up polluted areas, stuff like that.
Exactly.
And then the other 80% gets a little bit more interesting.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
It goes into general purpose bonds from companies whose everyday business practices actually support biodiversity.
So it's not just about funding specific projects. It's about supporting companies that are already doing good for the planet.
That's the idea.
Wait, hold on a second.
Yeah.
You said unlabeled bonds. How do we know that money is actually going towards helping biodiversity?
That's a great question, and it's one that Goldman Sachs is really trying to address head on.
Okay.
They're being incredibly careful about which companies they choose.
So it's not just a free-for-all.
No, not at all. They're specifically looking for companies whose business models are inherently aligned with biodiversity goals.
Okay, give me an example.
So think about waste management companies. Their entire operation is built around reducing pollution and promoting resource recovery.
So they're already doing the work.
Exactly. So investing in these companies is like investing in solutions, not just specific projects.
I can see it's about supporting a whole system rather than just one-off initiatives.
Right. It's about looking at the bigger picture.
Okay, but, some people might hear this and think it sounds a little bit like greenwashing.
I can see why they might think that.
How can investors be sure that this money is actually making a difference?
That's where transparency comes in.
Okay.
Goldman Sachs has developed this really in-depth, sustainable investing framework
Oh, wow.
that they use to evaluate companies and make sure that they're actually walking the walk when it comes to biodiversity.
So they're not just taking companies at their word.
No, they're doing their due diligence, they're looking at environmental data, they're analyzing supply chains, they're really digging deep.
So they're trying to make sure that these investments are actually having a positive impact.
Exactly. They're trying to raise the bar for what it means to be a sustainable company.
And it's not just about avoiding harm. It's about actively contributing to a healthier planet.
That's a key point.
So this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
They're partnering with the MIT IBM Watson AI Lab
Pretty cool, or?
to develop these cutting-edge tools for measuring biodiversity impact.
Yeah, it's pretty next-level stuff.
AI for biodiversity, that's amazing.
It is, imagine AI analyzing satellite images, drone data,
Yeah.
all sorts of information to track how ecosystems are changing over time.
So it's not just relying on self-reporting.
No, it's about getting a much more accurate picture of what's actually happening on the ground.
So we're talking about using AI to track things like deforestation or habitat loss.
Exactly. It's about getting real-time, data-driven insights into how these investments are actually affecting biodiversity.
So we're talking about using AI to track things like deforestation or habitat loss, right?
Exactly. It's about getting a real-time, data-driven understanding of how these investments are impacting biodiversity on the ground. And this is crucial because, as we know, measuring biodiversity is way more complex than just tracking carbon emissions.
Okay, so walk me through this. How's this different from those traditional green bonds we hear so much about?
Well, green bonds often have this broad environmental focus, which is great, but it can be a bit of a catch-all. This biodiversity fund zeroes in on a very specific goal.
I like that analogy. Precision is key when it comes to something as intricate as biodiversity.
Absolutely. And that precision extends to how the fund is structured. Remember those labeled bonds we talked about, the ones directly funding biodiversity projects?
So the 20% dedicated to direct action.
Right. Those bonds are aligned with the International Capital Market Association's Green, Social, and Sustainability Bond Principles. It's a pretty rigorous set of standards, so investors can be confident that their money is being used for legitimate biodiversity-enhancing activities.
So it's not just any old tree planting project that qualifies.
Not at all. Think large-scale forest restoration initiatives, habitat rehabilitation, sustainable land management practices, activities with a proven track record of supporting biodiversity.
And going back to Goldman Sachs' experience, I'm guessing those labeled bonds are drawing on some of their past conservation work.
You got it. They're leveraging that expertise to select projects that are not only environmentally sound, but also financially viable. It's about striking that balance between impact and return.
Which makes sense, because at the end of the day, this is still an investment fund. Investors want to see their money grow.
Of course. But what's interesting here is that Goldman Sachs is betting that by focusing on biodiversity, they can actually enhance returns in the long run.
Because a healthy planet is good for business.
Exactly. Biodiversity underpins so many of the essential services that our economies rely on: clean water, pollination, climate regulation. By investing in biodiversity, you're essentially investing in the stability and resilience of those systems.
It's like an insurance policy for the future of our economy.
And one that could pay off handsomely. Now, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about those unlabeled bonds, the 80% that's invested in companies with biodiversity-friendly business practices.
Right, the ones that raised some eyebrows earlier. How does Goldman Sachs ensure those companies are actually making a difference?
Transparency and accountability are key here. They've developed a comprehensive framework to assess those companies based on a range of factors: their environmental footprint, their supply chain practices, their commitment to sustainable innovation.
So they're not just looking at a company's bottom line. They're taking a holistic view of their operations and their impact on biodiversity.
Precisely. And they're looking for companies that are already leaders in their respective sectors, companies that are setting the bar for sustainable practices.
So in a way, they're incentivizing other companies to step up their game.
Absolutely. This fund is not just about directing capital to biodiversity projects. It's about shifting the entire market towards a more sustainable model.
And I imagine the timing of this fund's launch is no coincidence. It seems to align perfectly with the growing global momentum around biodiversity conservation.
You're absolutely right. We've got those big UN biodiversity conferences happening, the push to secure $200 billion annually for nature protection by 2030. This fund is stepping into that space at a crucial moment.
It's like they're saying, we're ready to put our money where our mouth is and be part of the solution.
And that's a powerful message to send to the rest of the financial world. But let's be realistic. There are always risks involved with any investment. What are some of the potential challenges this fund might face?
Well, policy uncertainty is a big one, especially in certain regions, where the political landscape for sustainability can be quite volatile. Regulatory changes could impact the bond market, potentially affecting issuance volumes and investor confidence.
And then there's the whole issue of accurately measuring biodiversity impact, right? Despite all those fancy AI tools, it's still a complex science.
You're right, it's an ongoing challenge, and the tools are constantly evolving. But the fact that Goldman Sachs is investing heavily in these cutting-edge technologies demonstrates their commitment to transparency and accountability. It's like they're saying, we're not just throwing money at the problem, we're trying to do this right.
And that dedication is what's needed to drive meaningful change in this space. But it's important to remember that Goldman Sachs isn't alone in this endeavor. Other financial giants are also starting to recognize the importance of biodiversity and its connection to financial success.
We've touched upon JP Morgan's direct involvement in forest management. Are there other examples of this trend?
Absolutely. We're seeing a surge in interest in nature-based solutions, with investors looking at everything from sustainable agriculture to regenerative ocean farming.
So it's not just about protecting existing ecosystems, it's about finding innovative ways to restore and enhance biodiversity.
Exactly. And that's what makes this such an exciting time to be involved in sustainable finance. We're witnessing a fundamental shift in thinking, a recognition that nature is not just something nice to have, it's the foundation of our economic prosperity.
It's like we're finally starting to connect the dots.
And those connections are leading to some truly innovative investment strategies, like this Biodiversity Bond Fund. It's a sign that the financial world is finally starting to wake up to the importance of biodiversity and its value for a sustainable future.
And that's a message worth amplifying. But before we get too carried away with the potential of this fund, let's take a step back and compare it to what other asset managers are doing in the biodiversity space.
Yeah.
How does Goldman Sachs' approach stack up against the competition? So are we talking like a totally new playing field here?
Yeah.
Or are there other funds out there that are trying to do something similar?
Well, Goldman is definitely in a pretty unique spot with this dedicated biodiversity bond fund. I mean, it's really the first of its kind to offer this level of focus specifically on biodiversity. And, it's doing it within the fixed income market, which makes it more accessible.
Yeah, because we were talking about earlier how most of the action in biodiversity investing has been happening with like private equity and those less liquid markets, which
Yeah, exactly. Harder to get into.
can be a little bit of a closed club, for the average investor.
Absolutely. And, even within the fixed income world, usually biodiversity is kind of lumped in with broader ESG or green bond strategies.
So this is really like Goldman saying, you know what, biodiversity is important enough to have its own dedicated fund.
Exactly. They're putting a stake in the ground. And I think that's really powerful.
And it seems like they're kind of betting on the fact that this focus is not only going to generate positive impact, but also attract investors who are looking for ways to really put their money where their values are.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a growing awareness among investors that, biodiversity is not just this like fluffy environmental issue.
Right.
It's actually tied to financial risk and long-term economic stability.
Right. Because if the planet's not healthy, the economy's not going to be healthy.
Exactly. So, as this awareness keeps growing, I think we're going to see even more innovation in this space.
Like what kind of stuff are you thinking?
I think we're going to see new financial products and strategies popping up that are really aimed at tackling this biodiversity crisis head on.
So how do other big players in sustainable investing measure up to this? Are they taking a similar approach or are they kind of behind the curve?
It's a mixed bag. You've got some institutions like JP Morgan's timber investment arm. They're taking a more direct approach by actually buying and managing forest land.
So they're getting their hands dirty, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. It's like hands-on conservation rather than just, financial investment.
Right.
But even within the investment realm, Goldman Sachs isn't new to this whole sustainability game. I mean, they've already got a pretty impressive portfolio of sustainable bond funds.
Yeah, this is building on, a foundation that they already have.
Yeah, for sure. They've got green bonds, social bonds, impact bonds, even a global green bond ETF.
They're not messing around.
No, they're not. But what makes this biodiversity fund different is that laser focus,
It's like they're saying this is important.
Yeah, exactly. This is important enough to warrant its own dedicated fund, and that's a big deal.
A pretty powerful statement.
It is.
Okay, so to wrap things up for our listeners who are out there, wanting to make a difference with their investments, is this fund a potential game changer?
I think it has the potential to it's a really tangible way to support biodiversity conservation while still, participating in the financial markets.
And it's not just about feeling good, it's about actually, making a real impact.
Exactly. And as this trend gains momentum, I think we're going to see even more opportunities for investors to align their portfolios with a sustainable future.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on it. Thank you so much for joining us today and taking us on this deep dive into the world of biodiversity finance. It's been really enlightening.
My pleasure. And, remember, protecting biodiversity isn't just an environmental thing, it's an economic imperative, too. By investing in nature, we're really investing in ourselves.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Thanks again, and for everyone listening out there, we'll be back next week with another deep dive into the forces shaping our world. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep pushing for a more sustainable future.